More than a quarter of Americans now claim no religious affiliation.
The amount of Canadians who don't follow any type of religion is growing every year.
People in Britain are losing faith. More people than ever have described themselves as having no religion.
Let's face it, since the 1970s, religious participation in the West has been in steady decline. Fewer people attend houses of worship, and in census polls, fewer people consider themselves affiliated with mainstream religions. But the result in many cases has not simply been a more atheist society. It is now understood that there is a deeply religious impulse that human beings need to satisfy on an existential level. So instead, that God-shaped hole is being filled with things that you wouldn't normally associate with religion. The wellness industry provides cult-like gurus and quasi-mystical experiences through body worship and self-denial. The social justice movement appeals to a need for a more moral cause and provides the black and white heroes and enemies. And fandom in sports and music builds a sense of collective belonging, which can help us transcend our petty individual identities. These are what the writer Tara Isabella Burton calls remixed religion.
Instead, we're seeing people approach religion kind of much more individualistically as, how can I get my individual needs for meaning or purpose or ritual or community met? And the way that I want to approach this is by kind of mixing and matching, figuring out what works for me. This is sort of what I call religious remixing.
But for all the good vibes and inclusivity that these outlets provide, we're starting to see a newer shift away from this trend and back towards traditional religion. You may say it's a longing for the simpler days of the past, but I have a different theory. These quasi-religions are lacking a fundamental element which makes them ultimately unsustainable for satisfying that religious instinct in the first place. So we're here to ask the question, what does religion have that the wellness gurus, the activists, and the sports teams do not? Here's the Mensch Sense take. Our journey begins in an unlikely place with two existentialist philosophers who wrote a book about finding meaning in a secular age.
Our age is a secular age in the following sense. Even for people who are religious believers, religion doesn't play the role in their lives that it used to play in earlier epochs in the history of the West.
They had a profound theory about why we've lost that sense of meaning, and to illustrate it, they compare the philosophies of two contemporary best-selling fiction authors. The first is the great David Foster Wallace. His staggering works of genius like Infinite Jest earned him a cult following and a reputation as one of the great literary minds of the 90s and 2000s. In 2005, he delivered a now famous commencement speech entitled "This is Water." He addressed what he saw was the dull, young professional future that these graduates were about to face.
You graduating seniors do not yet have any clue what day in, day out really means. Boredom, routine, and petty frustration.
How do you transform this consumer hell into a tolerable existence? He had one simple but beautiful answer.
It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred. On fire with the same force that lit the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down.
I think many people would subscribe to Wallace's remedy for meaning in our lives. He's essentially saying, meaning is what you make it. With the right mindset, you can choose to look at everything as an opportunity for connection, for compassion, and for significance. Everything can be meaningful. There's only one problem. It doesn't really work. It seems that for Wallace, this was a very personal subject. He wrote a lot about finding happiness in otherwise miserable situations. And the reason was because he himself battled with depression for most of his life. And in 2010, he lost that battle. Our existentialist philosophers drew the conclusion that for all of David Foster Wallace's idealism, there are plenty of situations where we humans don't have the capacity to create our own meaning out of nothing. There are moments of tragedy, sadness, or simply times where we are too tired or numb to choose to see the mystical oneness of all things deep down. So that's why, to find a more sustainable source of meaning, we turn to mystery author number 2. Her book spent over a year on the bestseller list, but she doesn't quite have the same intellectual appeal as David Foster Wallace. She's known for novels about finding love and discovering yourself through travel. Can you guess who we're talking about? Elizabeth Gilbert. is most well known for her colossal bestseller, Eat, Pray, Love. Not exactly a genre-bending work of literary significance, and yet our existentialist philosophers found a beacon of truth in her TED Talk on the nature of writer's block.
Somehow we've completely internalized and accepted collectively this notion that creativity and suffering are somehow inherently linked, and that artistry, in the end, will always ultimately lead to anguish.
Gilbert looks at the long list of artists whose lives ended early because of the pressure they felt to live up to their own reputations. She suspects that sometime in the last few centuries, we made a crucial mistake about where creativity comes from.
Ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people did not happen to believe that creativity came from human beings back then, okay? People believed that creativity was this divine attendant spirit that came to human beings from some distant and unknowable source. The Romans had the same idea, but they called that sort of disembodied creative spirit a genius. And then the Renaissance came and everything changed, and we had this big idea, and the big idea was, let's put the individual human being at the center of the universe, right? And for the first time in history, you start to hear people referring to this or that artist as being a genius rather than having a genius.
You may be starting to put the pieces together here. Whereas David Foster Wallace relied on his own inner compass to be the source of all meaning, Elizabeth Gilbert says that's the stuff that will drive you crazy. We never used to think that we were the source of our own greatest moments. They were always the work of something beyond us that we merely channeled. And this brings us to our assessment of modern-day quasi-religions. These outlets all attempt to satisfy one or more religious impulses, whether it's spiritual transcendence, communion with others, or a moral crusade. But each of them relies on one thing to make them truly meaningful. We have to choose to give them meaning. A soccer team may be a great way to bond with others, but at the end of the day, there is no objective significance to putting a ball in a net. A social justice campaign might go even deeper, touching on a felt desire to correct historical wrongs or uplift the marginalized, but their secular tone means that there is no weight behind their moral claims other than the fact that they feel it's right. At the end of the day, all of them are lacking one fundamental ingredient: obligation. Whereas a wellness retreat is ultimately about feeling good, a religion demands that a person commit to something higher, even when it doesn't feel good. And this makes all the difference, because truly accepting the authority of something higher is the very thing that Elizabeth Gilbert and our philosophers both said is what gives us true meaning. It's when we surrender, when we admit that we are not the source of truth, that our lives become imbued with a sense that we are living for more than our own immediate gratification. This is why Tara Isabella Burton, who studied these remixed religions, has herself returned towards traditional religion.
Organized religion has been a really fulfilling corrective or counterweight to a culture that all too often, I feel, tells me that I should be out there looking for some kind of mysterious actualization that may or may not exist. Narratives of personal freedom or personal fulfillment became less important to me than questions of what does the good life look like? What are our obligations to one another, and how do we live those out?
There may be legitimate reasons why the last generations have been leaving organized religion. Some may have been disillusioned by a lack of emphasis on the experience of real awe and transcendence that our traditions once nurtured. Others may have been turned off by past abuses of authority that religious institutions have carried out. But many have probably simply been swayed by the appeal of a life without rules or commitments, where we are simply free to indulge in whatever feels right. Ironically, however, it's that commitment to obligation and rules that provides the possibility of real transcendence, morality, and meaning. No wonder, then, that the youth are starting to stage their own rebellion by returning to the religion that their parents once abandoned. And that makes mensch sense.